Hi, this is Brock from Orange Peel Bikes, hanging out in sunny Steamboat in front of our old train depot. It's now the art center here in town. Enjoying the sun, good riding, awesome town. Orange Peel Bikes is cycling in Steamboat Springs, sunny days, road riding, mountain biking, teaching kids to ride, having fun. In this episode, we're exploring suspension and taking a look at different types, such as the split pivot, the DW link, and the 4-bar. We'll also be looking at a segment from Orbea and checking in with team transition. But first, Orange Peel TV is about enjoying every day. Lots of people out riding, having fun. Thanks for tuning in to Orange Peel TV. I'd like to touch base on mountain bike suspension for a bit. There's a lot of different designs, all with the same goal. And what that goal is to allow the bike to absorb bumps efficiently, yet not slow you down when you're pedaling. And that's easier said than done. Suspension is actually pretty heavy engineering. And there's a couple people out there who actually own most of the intellectual property around suspension, which is kind of funny. Particularly one guy, you'll see his initials a lot, DW, Dave Weigel.
Hi, I'm Dave Weigel. Welcome to my shop here in Edgartown, Massachusetts. In case you're wondering what this big chunk of machinery behind me is, that's my Roerg EMA shock dyno. It's what I use to tune all of the dampers in the prototype stages.
Dave Weigel has designed more suspension for different applications than just about anyone in the world. This Pivot Cycles bike uses a modified DW link design, so it's partially designed by this guy Dave Weigel. And what that is a short link design and a unified rear triangle. So to simplify that, the rear of the bike is all one piece and all the movement is done up close. That allows for a really stiff bike, specifically laterally, and kind of a supple ride quality that also pedals really well.
Y'all better not come to my studio with that food.
The pivot bikes in particular are our favorite bikes for pure pedaling performance. The stiff feel of this suspension is really evident when you're laying pressure to the pedals. It's a really interesting design too, in that the initial bump, what we call small bump, allows this bike, this whole rear end, to extend. It's called a rearward wheel path before it really gets into the suspension. And how Pivot has designed these is to feel differently depending on what the impact is. The beginning small bump, you barely even notice the suspension is working, yet it is. In the middle of the suspension, meaning you're using up a bit of this travel, they start to feel really, really soft, really supple, and then they ramp back up at the end so you don't bottom it out. It's a non-linear path, if you want to get technical, in their suspension curve. Stay tuned for more Orange Peel TV. Next up, Team Transition takes us riding on their backyard trails.
Hey, hon, ready to go for a ride?
Stay tuned for more Orange Peel TV. Next up, we have an example of the classic 4-bar suspension. This is a tried and true suspension design that many manufacturers use. It's actually past any sort of intellectual property. It's what we call open source. So manufacturers are able to interpret it as they want to without getting into patent discussions. But really, it's personally my favorite suspension design for pure bump compliance. We've got 4 pivot points here, 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 and here. So the whole suspension can float, as it were. And now it had the reputation of being slightly flexy because of all of those pivot points. Modern bikes, good sealed bearings, big sturdy tubes. Much of that flexible nature has been rectified over time. But what I like about these bikes is that wherever you are at in the suspension, be it a small bump or a big bump, the bike handles the same. The rear and the front wheel travel at approximately the same path, so it just feels really balanced when set up properly. Now, it can also suffer from what we call pedal-induced bob a bit, meaning as you're pushing on the pedals, the suspension can kind of activate. That really is almost more dependent on the rider, and this bike benefits someone who pedals smoothly and efficiently, and if you do, you can really experience it's kind of like floating on a cloud, a very nice, supple, consistent suspension design. It's why it's been so popular over the years. We're back to our friend Dave Weigel again, on a different suspension design he has been involved with. And this one's called the split pivot. And the idea with split pivot is to try to have a few benefits of the first bike, the DW Link, and some of the benefits of the 4-bar suspension, yet be unique on the marketplace. And so what he did was designed a suspension that kind of has some of the link driven, like the blue pivot we showed you, and then the 4 pivot points of the 4-bar. This one, however, the main thing is that it splits around the rear axle. Can't really see it because it's all inside here, but there's a moving bearing that this rear wheel is able to float as it goes through travel. These bikes ride really well. They kind of feel, if you ride them head to head, just like I told you, a mix of the 2 previous mentioned suspension designs with one big benefit. They're inexpensive to produce. And so you're going to see a lot of these split pivot bikes on the market because it's easier to manufacture, and it still works pretty darn well. The one drawback that we've seen is because there is some moving parts around the rear axle, that it requires a bit of just upkeep, double checking the bolts stay tight and things like that. It also requires a specific custom-made rear axle that accommodates all of that. It's not something you can find easy parts for except from the manufacturer. Other than that, I really like these suspension designs and I'm quite happy with it. Stay tuned for more Orange Peel TV. Next up, let's take a look at some awesome shredding with Team Pivot riders Bernard and Emily.
Yeah, we got the new KH125. Jack and Charlie helped pimped out in Fort William. She's just nice, you know, cruising to track in the mornings before the races and stuff. Gets you in a good mood, and yeah, it's just a sweet ride. Schlamming's insane. The turns are like inverted, like the ruts and berms. You can just lean in as hard as you want. Like, it's that sick. It's got some cool jumps, and everyone's here like at this time of year, so it goes off. Yeah, it's so sick having Emily here, especially when the main man Elliot's not here, which kind of sucks, but she's so much fun and she's killing it right now, and she's learning to whip and stuff, which is sick. So gonna have another good week riding here, and should be sick.
I'm gone and you don't even know twice. All these
think her jumping's getting a lot better and stuff, and she's working on a star, which is sick. So can't wait to get to Lenzerheide, like in her home country, for the next race and go wild. And Brat's always like a different kind of race each year. Philip Polk's super cool guy, puts us up in a hotel and gets us out there. And track's always gnarly.
Doing track walk with Polk, Brat, man, dying right now, but looks sick. Pretty sick, man. Triple in, bombing down the stairs. It's like the end of this section now, and we just got the last death drop to the finish line. Some dude, man, was up in the trees, like, blew way past the wall ride. Someone else has smoked a wheel. It's going crazy. Man, I'm gonna go out and set 45 feet, and normally I don't set jumps that long, but that's long.
There was an EU summit, so some Nazis came for a riot, which kind of killed the vibe in the end. Someone got stopped mid-run, and they ripped the timing cable, punched a TV guy, and that put an end to that race. Like, still sick to be out there. Just a shame we didn't get to race in the end, so no one came anywhere. So. Pivot team sitting in 5th in the overall right now, which is awesome. We're ahead of some big companies and big other teams, so sick to be up there. And my overall is pretty sick, like my best ever. I'm in 15th right now, Emily in 6th, so we just need to get EJ back in the game for the next race, and we'll be good to go.
Stay tuned for more Orange Peel TV. Suspension tuning and setup is one of our most frequently asked questions here at the bike shop. Full suspension mountain bike has a wide degree of customization available to the rider depending on body weight, your terrain you're riding, your racing versus having fun, if you have a back problem, etc. But it's also one of the things on the bike that people don't understand. So I'm going to try to give you a basic lesson on suspension tuning using this transition patrol right here.
Yeah. It's the return of the wild style fashion and smashing hits.
And for the average rider, an air sprung fork is going to be your best choice. And what that means is inside the suspension fork, there's actually an air spring, just like we use in your tires. On this RockShox Pike, which is an amazing fork, we have an air cap. And underneath that air cap is a valve. And we can just change the pressure on this really easily. And sometimes riders will fiddle with these pressures constantly. Other times people will just decide, set it up and forget about it. And for that rider, on the back of most of these forks now, there's a pressure range for your body weight.
Adapt to this, put pizzazz and jazz in this, the cash in this, master this, blast this and make a clap to this. DJs don't want cuts and obey the crap.
Another thing most modern forks have is a compression dampener, often called the lockout. Right now, with the damper open, fork kind of oscillates up and down with a compression. Imagine instead of me pushing down on it, we were hitting a rock at that point. But with this dampener closed, it does give a little, but I can pretty much put my whole body weight on it without it going. So it's potentially better for climbing or a road section or riding to the bar after you're done mountain biking.
The TVs, I find it easy catching diabetes from fly sweeties. Sit back and wait to hear slam and track. Rock a jam while popular demand. I'm back. I control the crowd. You know I hold it.
And many forks, lastly, have at the bottom of the suspension a knob, which is for the return rate, what we call rebound. Once your suspension fork compresses, it obviously needs to come back up. And that controls how quickly or slowly the suspension fork goes back to its original stance. The idea is a faster rebound is better for keeping your wheel on the ground, but it can feel like a pogo stick. So there's always going to be some sort of tuning needed. Whereas someone who's jumping or free riding or racing downhill will often have a slightly slower rebound, just so they don't bounce back off the bike because the big compressions that they go through.
Control the crowd, you know I hold it down. When the top, you know it's jiggy when you hear the sound. From town to town, until it's world renowned. Yeah, I rock New York City all year round.
Next up, we're taking a look at suspension setup with transition bikes.
We're going to show you how to do it seated because it's a little bit easier to do it without a partner or a friend there. But the important thing is to be consistent. So if you do it seated, always do it seated. If you do it standing, always do it standing. So I'm going to compress the bike a couple of times, just let it settle naturally, and take my seated position. Then I'm going to reach down with my hand, pull the O-ring to the top, and I'm going to slowly dismount. And it's really important here to make sure that you don't accidentally compress the shock more as you're getting off the bike. Now I can look at the side and see where I'm at. So we came out a little bit over 40% sag. We run a lot of sag on these bikes, but that's too much. So we're gonna add some air to the main chamber and see where we can end up. Remember, every shock pump is calibrated a little bit differently. So if you check with one shock pump at home and another pump out on the trail, you're gonna get different readings. So make sure that you're using the same shock pump consistently. In this case, for this bike, I know that I start roughly about 5 PSI more than my body weight. I weigh 175 pounds and I've got probably 7 pounds of beer, so we'll start there. We pumped up our shock to about 185 PSI, and we'll check it again. Because this is a RockShox Monarch with a Debonair, that means it's got a big negative air chamber. And that air chamber fills from the air we just put in the positive air chamber. So before we check our sag, we need to cycle the suspension a couple of times and allow those two chambers to equalize. We can just grab the bike, gently compress, and let the suspension back several times. So we lost a couple of PSI there. Some of that was from threading the shock pump on, some of that was from the air moving into a different chamber. So I'm gonna get it back up to where I wanted it, about 185 PSI. Too much, so I can use the release valve and just slowly let air out. Perfect. Partway through the process. It's a lot of work. You need to save some energy for the trails. So now we're ready to check our sag again. Remember, consistency is key, so if you did it seated last time, you're gonna do it seated again. Compress the suspension a couple of times, then sit, reach down and raise the O-ring, and then slowly step off the bike again. So there you go, right at about 35% sag, which is where we recommend starting.
Stay tuned for more Orange Peel TV. Next up, we've got Orbea's Enduro Team. As opposed to the air suspension, which we've already discussed, I'd like to show you a coil sprung suspension. This is tuned by physically changing out this metal coil spring. And the beauty of this style of suspension is it has a really supple feel, just what we call a good travel. When you ride one, you'd get it. It's hard to kind of explain, but there's some big downsides to it. One, it's not as easily tunable for body weight of the rider. Two, super heavy. This is a big, probably half a pound of just pure metal here, as opposed to the other style is light, it's air. So, there's some detriments here. So that's why you really mostly see this style of suspension on downhill and really aggressive riding, free ride and jumping style bikes. It's a great riding product, but definitely limited right now to a certain niche in the market. While discussing coil sprung suspension, we can't forget about the fork either. And this bike is set up with the same. And what it has in it is, maybe not this exact product, but a coil spring inside either one or both of the legs, depending on the fork. Now, once again, not as easily tuned than as opposed to just pumping it up with a little suspension pump, but very durable, very nice riding product. Oftentimes on these forks as well, we lose lockouts. There's no point in having an uphill climbing mode, for example, if the bike is really designed for going downhill only. Thanks for tuning in to Orange Peel TV. This is Brock from Orange Peel Bikes, inviting you down to our locally owned bike shop, the corner of 12th and Yempa Street in downtown Steamboat Springs.